Hello. Now, after the tech difficulties, remember never have YouTube opened at the same time. Even just if you want to have it opened, mute YouTube. Otherwise, you will get how is that called when you hear
feedback.
a feedback. And feedback is not always the best, except especially audio feedback. So, welcome from myself, Florian Lorenz from Smarter Than Car, Joshua Grigsby here. Next to myself, and we are having a conversation today with Kieran Smith of Bicycle Urbanism UK. Hello, Kieran.
Hi there. How are you doing?
We also figured out the audio finally. It's great to meet up. You have been doing a massive amount of work actually over the last months and years. And you have approached us here at STC with you just mailed us and said, look, we should be talking about specific topics and let's have an exchange. And so we suggested to have this hangout without knowing how complicated it can be technically.
Yeah.
But we figured it out. Can you just tell us about what your blog and your work is about? I think that this is interesting.
Sure. So I'm working as a landscape architect at the moment, but I'm hoping to start a PhD. I've been awarded a scholarship to do some research on raising levels of urban cycling. So it started with a study tour I took last year. This time last year, I took a trip around Denmark and the Netherlands. I did some research. I looked at the cycle paths there, and then when I came back to the UK, I started writing about how we can learn from these countries and how we can implement such infrastructure and raise levels of urban cycling. From there, I've just built on this. I wrote a dissertation about the subject, and I have produced my website, which you can follow me on Twitter, and I just keep involved with it that way.
And what is your what is your interest? What is the further goal with the blog?
So it's about raising awareness, raising momentum, basically helping people see the benefits of mainstreaming urban cycling and raising questions about how such a bicycle dominant situation might be reached. And basically we're seeing a sort of, well, renaissance maybe. We're seeing rising levels of urban cycling here, and but no one's really thinking about it. It's just happening quite haphazardly. I'm based here in Bristol, which is one of the top cycling cities in the UK. It's still pretty bad, but cycling is growing quite quickly here, and we have just recently that one of the Chinese companies have brought over the shared bikes. They're called Yo bikes, and already we're seeing a sort of lack of parking in the city, lack of bike parking, and you're seeing that the infrastructure being sort of tested, and the results are sort of quite less than satisfactory. Whereas I think with a little more thought, they could be quite sort of exemplary.
What's your own background with this? I mean, have you always been a cyclist? Did you sort of discover cycling at some point and have that eureka moment?
No, I wouldn't say that. I just grew up cycling and I never stopped. Whereas I guess most people stop at some point. But I just persisted, even though I guess once you get to around age 16 and start cycling on the road, you have some kind of conflict situation that might put you off. But I just kept cycling, and you know, every time you have some kind of issue, you just become more thoughtful about how and why the urban landscape doesn't really serve cyclists in the UK anyway.
And you had some specific questions for us here at STC, and we will come to them in a second. For the ones who don't know Smarter Than Car, I just wanted to just briefly introduce our organization, our small organization, very briefly. We say a future urban mobility think tank, and we started meanwhile more than 7 years ago in China. We have been funded by cycling activists in China, and have then shifted our focus also away from China and to Europe, and have been doing work in Europe, in Asia, and in Latin America. And we have widened sort of our work. We see cycling has been the start of our work, but we have broadened our agenda and our interests. And at the moment, we do different projects. We work on urban decarbonization, so basically thinking about cities beyond the use of fossil fuels, and how that can be realized. And of course, the bicycle plays an interesting role in that, because it's sort of the indicator species for that condition, where you're not dependent on fossil fuels anymore, and the use of privately owned cars. Do you want to add something?
Maybe just with the idea of bicycle urbanism and looking at how these sort of things develop. I mean, it's when you start with the bike, it's easy for people to mistake that as thinking that you are just talking about cyclists and this is the sort of one fringe. But I think, I mean, for me, I also did a little bit of cycling around Denmark and the Netherlands. And for somebody coming from the United States, I found it really remarkable and eye-opening. All of a sudden, you see how the bike could be a normal mode of transport. I was asking the question earlier to you because about your own experience cycling, because for me, I had the sort of classic American background of rode a bike until I could drive. The moment that I was able to get my license, I got it, had a car, made every trip by car. And it wasn't until 15 years later that I just happened to, my car needed repairs. I didn't have the money to pay for it, just took a bike to try and get around, and found, to my great surprise, that it was actually faster and easier to make, I would say, 90% of my trips by bike. I enjoyed it more. All of a sudden, I no longer dreaded going to the supermarket or going to the post office. It became fun. And that was in a situation where there was no cycling infrastructure, nothing useful and helpful. And then going to a place like the Netherlands and seeing how that is normalized, it starts you with the point of getting on a bike and riding, and quickly goes beyond that to the way that we think of moving, about the spaces of moving, the ways that we move, what we do, how we react to our environment, how we relate to each other. Hence the sort of urbanism side. And in terms of Smarter Than Car, I think where this really came out of was, being in China and seeing how, 30 years ago, you're seeing a city like Beijing, at the time with 5.5 million people or so, and you got basically 60% of trips being made on bike, and you've got more than 3 million daily cyclists. You can see how a major metropolis can actually run on bike, and seeing the way that it's not just the trips, of course. That means how space is designed. That means how buildings relate to the street. That's all sorts of different things. So you'd see bicycle livelihoods was one of sort of our early projects, looking at how small-scale economic endeavors would use the bike as a kind of platform. So you'd have mobile, let's say, barbershops, mobile vegetable stands, mobile bike repair places. Just about any kind of small-scale business could be put on wheels and moved around to wherever the demand is. That also changes how you use the street, the kind of, how you can, let's say, plant it or design it. all sorts of stuff. So, you know, I think for both of us, it started with an interest in cycling. We had this idea of, through lived experience, of being on a bike changes the way that you experience a city. And then it's the deep dive, like why? You know, you just keep going and going and going and trying to understand how all these things connect. So when we saw that you were doing, you know, this, using the term bicycle urbanism and developing that, it was exciting for us, because that's for us. You put the bike in a city and make it normal, and you have a different kind of urbanism.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was in the initial stages of this project, I came across a talk by Florian, and that term bicycle urbanism really just summed up what I was trying to explore.
Yeah, so do you want to shoot your questions?
Can I just ask,
Yeah, of course.
how many are there in Smarter Than Car? Are you, is it you guys? Is there anyone else? Or how many of you?
We are like, we two are the main active people, so that's we also why we're also directors, sort of. And it's important to state that we are doing this mainly next to our main activities, or let's say next to our livelihood activities. You know, where how we earn our living, which is at times very surprising to people and hard to grasp, because some people are like, okay, so this is your sort of hobby. You know, when I go somewhere and give a speech or whatever, and I show all the work that we have been doing, a lot of people ask us, so this is really, you're doing this next to your day job? That can be surprising. But we find it is a very good ventile to act as a free agent. You know, in Vienna, we very often do events and conversations, and we bring people together in a way that would not be possible if it would be a job, or if we would do it as a sort of as a service for somebody else. Which means that when we put together different events or projects, there's sort of a pool of people who have been involved, who come in. So, I mean, the two of us are the main active ones, but I mean, you could say that there's let's say a core team of 5 or 6, and then a sort of expanded team of really up to 25 or 30, depending on sort of what we're doing and of course who's available.
Sort of based globally, not just in Vienna and Beijing, is it?
Yes, we have the founding, so Shannon and Lehman, and also Ines have been founding Smarter Than Car. And there is a really nice story why it's called Smarter Than Car, because they...
I read that story, yeah.
Yeah?
Tell it.
Yeah, but let's just tell it, because that was really only a few weeks before I joined them, but they met for a birthday party, and there were people arriving by public transport and by car and by walking and by bike.
Where
and the
this?
only ones who were on time actually were the people on the bike. So they just started to say, okay, but this is really smarter to be on the bike than to be on the car. And yeah, so this is and a lot of the projects that we have done recently, we even thought that it's a nice abbreviation for something that we could call Smarter Than Carbon. You know, that you don't. It's not only about sort of doing something against cars or beyond cars, and it's also we have been very aware, because the name Smarter Than Car sounds very provocational and confronting, a very anti in a way. So, for example, this week I met somebody at an event, and they had this Tesla showcase, you know, and I just, for the first time, I saw this Tesla Model X, which is like it's basically a car that is as compact like an SUV and as large like a van. and as heavy as a tank, but it's the role model for a new super sustainable car. So I was just questioning myself, how is, what does that lead to? And then I was exchanging business cards with that person who was sort of spent the previous 10 minutes telling me about the advantages of the Tesla, and then you give the person a business card saying "smarter than car" on it, So in these cases, sometimes it can be very provocational, but a lot of people really understand it, and also we understand it. It's not a discussion about the car. We need to discuss what's coming after the car, and that's also what a lot of our work nowadays is about.
We're just talking about sort of transport inside the city, because I'm not talking about transport outside the city, intercity transport. I don't consider bicycles in that context, I guess, but.
Well, and that would be the sort of, I don't know if caveat, but the sort of extension of smarter than car would be smarter than the car system in cities.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not. I mean, the car is an incredibly useful and pretty extraordinary, piece of machinery, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the transport system in urban areas based on a 210 chunk of steel that requires oil and advanced electronics to move around.
Yeah.
So it's context matters.
Yeah. Great. Shall we move on to some of my points? Firstly, quite broadly, what do you think is the most effective way to raise levels of urban cycling? Is it just a network of segregated lanes, so like an infrastructure measure, or is it policy? Can it be a soft political measure that could have a similar effect, or possibly a combination of these two things?
I would say I would start by giving the totally non-specific answer of it depends. Again, in terms of context matters. I think the first thing you need to do, any place where cycling is not a normal sort of mode of transport, of daily mobility, you have to understand why in that specific context. It may be culture, it may be topography, it may be climate, it may be the types of trips people make, that people tend to make really long trips between work and home. The built environment, of course, plays a major role. There are a lot of different factors that could prevent cycling from being a sort of normal, daily, practical habit. So you got to start with that and look at why are people not cycling. I think once you've been able to do that and begin to sort of pinpoint what are those key things, then you can start, of course, reacting to them. And almost always it's a combination of infrastructure and policy. It may be, well, let's say it this way, the simplest thing, right? Everything in the end with urban mobility relates to space. So how is space being allocated? And how are the different things that are allowed or supported in space working with each other? So for example, you might say to somebody, well, the problem is that we don't have bike lanes, so we need to have lanes. But if you have a huge discrepancy in speed between cars racing by at 50 or 70 or whatever kilometers an hour, even with bike lanes, that becomes very uncomfortable to be on. So having a policy that slows down the speed of traffic so that all modes are moving at a more or less similar speed, along with infrastructure, you have that combination of infrastructure and policy, and you start creating an environment that suggests that it should be normal.
It's interesting, this question of different speeds in the same space, because even when you have cycle paths, say it's segregated cycle paths, you have cyclists, like you might have a kid cyclist just trundling along, and then you have like a racer, and there's tension there between these two people who have completely different needs. that's something that the car doesn't have to deal with necessarily.
Well,
I mean,
it doesn't have to deal with it now.
yeah,
Only because streets have been redesigned, an entire system of mediation through lights and signalization and dedicated lanes. I mean, go back 100 years, more or less, early 1920s, in the US, as the car is becoming a normal mode of transport, but it's having to negotiate its way through streets that were essentially just shared space. No lane definitions, no signalization. Everybody shares the same space.
Well,
I mean, the cars had to deal with it then, and
yeah.
So I mean, it's in some ways just it's the same issue once again of if you want things to share space, there has to be a certain similarity in speed of all users. The funny thing is, average speeds in cities are very similar. A massive study done a handful of years ago was looking at speeds in cities all over the world, and it looked at individual motor traffic and public transport. And it didn't matter what size city and where in the world, your average speed when you're moving through cities is somewhere between 18 and 22 kilometers an hour, or a comfortable cruising speed on a bike.
Okay, so that's quite a broad study. It took a sort of quite a large sample size, cities all over the world.
Yeah.
It's
with this mediated and immediate system, what we find interesting is that you when you have these sort of traffic territories, you know, and it really doesn't so much matter how much space you allocate to cars, to bikes or pedestrians. The important thing is that you separate them, and in places like Vienna, the people can get quite righteous about their space, you know. So you have like, don't enter my space, you stupid other traffic participant. So this sense of sharing and also caring for each other is sort of prevented or is taken away from the traffic participants because of that mediation. And if you have this system, you have sort of, for example, for the cars, you have, you know, everybody speeds up, and then at the next traffic light, everybody has to wait again. So after this whole sort of swarm of cars went to the next traffic light, you have like basically empty void space, you know. But this, what the study found, that these 17 to 18 kilometers, which is the same for any mode of transport or similar for any mode of transport, that this is sort of a continuous movement. And we have been thinking on putting forward the concept of negotiated flow, which is very similar to shared space, but not confined to small areas, where you basically on a longitudinal basis on sort of a pathway or way scale, that you say there is no mediation in the system, and at intersections and during traffic, basically traffic participants or different vehicles and different traffic users, that they actually take care of the mediation. And so the big problem nowadays still is that we have the motorized traffic participants that just have so much more force and potential energy in the system, and that's why this negotiation doesn't work at the moment. But now with the advent of self-driving cars, there is a lot of possibilities that in the future we will sort of get a new mediation or a more immediate traffic system. So it's a very interesting time in sort of traffic history, where we can potentially see a paradigm shift. You know, of course, it's also possible that we turn into a situation where we have automated cars that are sort of having their prioritized automated car highways through cities. because they have been stopped too often by pedestrians or cyclists. So
in this negotiated flow scenario, do you factor in all different modes of transport? Are pedestrians involved, cyclists, vehicles of all kinds?
I mean, the way to think of negotiated flow is it's essentially the same thing as shared space, but shared space is a design principle. Negotiated flow is a traffic principle. So it's just turning it around rather than looking at design of space, thinking of sort of regulation of traffic, or the basic principle that informs then what you begin to do. And I mean, again, if you think about urban traffic, no matter what, being relatively similar in speed and generally inefficient, as Flo pointed out, with speeding up and then slowing down. I mean, this is not a new sort of observation that if you just let it continue to flow, it's more efficient. It begins to sort itself out. What we like, and this is where we include the idea of negotiation, is it's taking the idea of walking on a crowded street. If you take any crowded street with a bunch of pedestrians, you wonder, why don't they all crash into each other?
That does, I see that, that's very clear. But when you introduce something like a bicycle, things change. I mean, here in Bristol, for example, every day I cycle to work, and a lot of the spaces that have been, they're shared space. Well, they're labeled shared space, so they have a sign saying shared space.
Right.
But they're not really shared space. They're just a wide pavement, and you see conflict happening because people bump into each other. I mean, cyclists and pedestrians go at different speeds, and people are weaving around each other. It's sort of I don't think it's very satisfactory. So I guess I'm trying to understand what negotiated flow is. It's this sort of, it's a principle not of the sort of configuration of the physical space, because I think that's what's important in shaping, because the configuration of the space, the design of it, the layout can limit the sort of power, the speed of some elements, some parts that would be shared space if it was effective.
I mean, negotiated flow would require a sort of a blank slate on the street, that you don't have a path for those people and a pathway for those people and a lane for those people, but you have like a space which is continuous where they can move, and they sort it out for themselves.
So it's, I mean, yeah, again, it's the traffic equivalent of shared space as a design principle. What's important to us with the idea of sort of negotiated, I mean, you're right, of course, that you need to have a built environment that supports it, and you also need a sort of critical mass to make it work. If you have too few of one type using the street, then you tend to have a takeover in practice by whatever the dominant group is. If it's too many people using it, it also doesn't flow so well. So I mean, there's a sweet spot, but that sweet spot is pretty wide. The important thing is this idea of negotiation, where you begin to shift the way that we perceive of ourselves in motion. In a system where everything is governed and regulated, we look at it as, this is my space and I don't have to pay attention to anybody around me. I just follow the system. You don't have to be a sort of participant, and you don't have to be very urban. You can be antisocial, in your tank, and just go. And that would apply to cyclists as well if you're on a very clearly defined system. To us, this is part of the idea of the urbanism side, that part of the deal of being in a city means that you are sharing space with others. You're sharing resources. There's a certain degree of negotiation that has to go on. So traffic should flow, according to this idea, at least of negotiated flow, based on acknowledging those that are around you and being able to sort of kind of quietly, silently, even unconsciously negotiating the shared use of space.
So it's almost a behavioral principle.
For sure.
I mean, do you not think that it's sort of dangerous because it's like the whole layout road system at the moment is designed to, so you don't have to have negotiated flow,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, at the moment, our system, it's designed to allow for the maximum of speed according to the vehicle you are using or not using.
Okay.
And at times, when these territories intersect, it can be very dangerous, especially for the minor groups that have less speed. So the promise of negotiated flow would be that everybody slows down and that you basically turn cities or these areas that are dedicated for negotiated flow into zones where you have a 30 kilometers per hour or 20 miles per hour maximum speed, which is a very strong threshold when it comes to fatalities and severe injuries, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sure you are aware of this curve that plots all sorts of injury data, and when you go, basically there is a big drop in fatalities at 50 kilometers per hour, and then there's another big drop at 30 kilometers per hour. So basically below 30 kilometers per hour, there's almost no fatal injuries or very little compared to above that. So this is, and then when you think about that nowadays, where we do everything possible to allow for the maximum speed of cars, and then still around the world we reach an average speed of 18 to 22 kilometers, and we still have such dangerous roads. It's sort of absurd.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does go back to what we were talking about before with speed. I mean, this is a critical thing is speed. If you have a situation where you have a big gap in speeds between whatever modes, then it begins to not work so well. What you do see in a lot of shared space environments is that the different modes adjust depending on the conditions. So if I'm cycling on a street with a lot of pedestrians and it's a shared space environment where I don't have a dedicated lane, I'm going to slow down during the times that I'm surrounded by a bunch of pedestrians. When those pedestrian flows begin to thin out, I speed up and adjust. So it's something that is sort of self-organizing and self-regulating. It can be stressful. It can be very frustrating initially. There's a lot more that you sensory input. You have to pay attention to a lot more things. There's a process, but it only really takes a couple of days to adapt to it, and then for it to be quite normal.
Well, I'm just thinking when you say this about streets in, say, Thailand and Vietnam, where everything's in like a big hubbub of activity that somehow makes sense, but it's quite dangerous in that sense. I think the only way it can become safe is if somehow you level the playing field, like between the different modes of transport, which I'm not sure how you're proposing you would accomplish.
Well, statistically, what you actually tend to find is that a lot of the places, a lot of streets, for example, in crowded cities in India, places that by default operate with a sort of negotiated flow or shared space, they seem much more terrifying to us because for us, normal is a mediated, signalized type of system. Statistically, they tend to be safer. You tend to have fewer dangerous accidents. You may have more sort of bumping into one another, but it's at low speeds. So actually, those systems tend to be more efficient and less dangerous. Again, they require a bit of getting used to.
Well, it's, I suppose in these sorts of systems, it becomes sort of self-evident which modes of transport are most efficient, and it becomes a function of the amount of space they take up on the road.
You adjust each other's adaptability. So, for example, if you have a wagon being pulled by a cow, your maneuverability is not very high and your speed is not very high. So the other modes on the sharing this space recognize that you're not good at turning and you're not good at going fast. So they anticipate that and react accordingly. Just like if it's a giant truck delivering something, you know, you respond to that. You know that cyclists tend to be quite mobile and agile. You know that pedestrians even more so. So, I mean, the different uses tend to normalize and kind of equal themselves out. But again, it all depends on speed. You mentioned, like, you know, Southeast Asia, a lot of these cities where you have mopeds or motorcycles, they don't take up the same kind of space as cars, but they tend to move awfully quickly. So that sort of ramping up of speed from being stationary to 40, 50 kilometers an hour and then slowing back down, that has a massive ripple effect through the whole traffic system.
Okay. Just one more question. I think it was the mayor of city in Colombia, possibly Medellin. I remember he said something like, you can measure the success of a city by the extent to which it caters for its most vulnerable. So it's the children and the elderly. I mean, where do they fit in? I mean,
well,
aren't you sort of relying on people's goodwill to a certain extent?
Well,
I think
yeah. First, I'll say that the quote you're referring to is Enrique Peñalosa when he was the mayor of Bogota, and he was saying that a sort of advanced city or a modern city should be one where the rich take public transport, not where the poor, you know, like it's the sort of inversion of what we tend to think is the rich take cars and the poor take public transport, and he's saying it should be the opposite. But to address your point about the sort of putting faith in one another, the thing is that we do that all the time. You know, we assume when we walk down the street or when we go anywhere that people aren't going to attack us. You look at even just driving and the amount of goodwill that is assumed that cars won't crash into each other, that they'll pay attention to the lights, that when I have my light, I'll walk across and somebody won't kill me. This is already something that's built in.
I see. I suppose what you're saying is that when you have this, did you say like a mediated system of stop and start, like a regulated flow, that it sort of absolves people of that responsibility to, you know, be aware of that there's sort of, I'm in a system now, this is how the system works. You don't have to sort of,
but we also still trust that people will follow those rules. So I mean, it's you know, sort of on both sides of this. It encourages us to ignore each other and to not sort of interact and negotiate, and that we would see that as sort of a negative. But the positive side is, even within that, of course, people don't have to follow those rules. They may just not notice, but we still put our faith in people that they will pay attention and they will be aware. And overwhelmingly, looking, you know, at percentages and stuff, they do. I mean, the reality is that life is much safer than we think it is.
I wanted to add something with. I also think that with the whole advent of smart city technologies and sensorized urban environments and traffic guidance systems, etc. I think what's going to happen, or let's say it's a possibility, that the whole mediation system also is getting more organic. You know, that, for example, in Vienna we have a few smart street lights that give pedestrians priority or turn green for pedestrians when they sense that there is no cars coming. You know, although it's not that it wouldn't be the regular rhythm of the traffic light. So I think with automated cars and new sensorized traffic guidance systems, sort of the mediated or the mediation system will get more organic, but also the behavior of people will then be sort of freer, you know, to move inside of the system. It's not, you know, I also think it's important to understand that there is different degrees of negotiated flow. You know, maybe there is negotiated flow which is very slow between pedestrians. When there's only pedestrians, then a few bikes are added up, and maybe the negotiation is very easy, or you can go a bit faster with the bike when there is only a few pedestrians. When you are entering with the bike, for example, as myself last week, the Rainbow Parade in Vienna, and you want to move through, then you at most go in walking speed with the bike. So it's really about adapting to the specific conditions, and there, yeah, I think it's gonna be a hybrid, but in this, if let's say like this, if we want to move beyond this very strict system where we basically have a sort of mobility factory in a city, you know, where transport is heavily regulated and everybody looks at lights that are blinking on top of our heads, which is a bit absurd, you know, because we are all sort of these zombies in this traffic guidance system that obey. If we sort of want to be smarter about that, we need to also enhance our vocabulary, and we think that negotiated flow is a concept that can add in this conversation.
Do you think that there's a sort of cultural aspect to it that might already be in place in some situations, like in places where you don't have so much cycle infrastructure, but like I'm thinking of Japan, for instance, where perhaps the culture fosters that sense of mutual cooperation on the pavement that might not be so easily achieved elsewhere in the world because of certain cultural values of politeness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only partly qualified to answer that. You know, we would need to ask cultural cultural anthropologists and sinologists that are also mobility and urban traffic experts. But when we started to, because this whole idea about negotiated flow came out of a few years, like 5 years ago, we were studying this urban history of the bicycle traffic in Beijing, and we researched and asked people, and were talking to sort of witnesses of the time, you know, people who had lived in the 80s in Beijing, and also planners and everybody. So we asked them what was the strategy for infrastructure, what was the infrastructure put in place, what was the cycling promotion of the 80s, you know, and we concluded that there was no specific cycling promotion strategy other than providing a lot of bikes for a very cheap price, and then also building the infrastructure, but the infrastructure was not dedicated bike lanes to some extent, but I mean, there are separated areas for pedestrians and then for the rest of the traffic, but especially end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, you had basically like a street, and that was shared between mostly bikes and a few buses and very, very few cars. So then we were like, how did these 3 million daily cyclists in Beijing in the mid 80s, you know, how did they manage to not bump into each other and not create a complete confusion? And also the people who cycled back then in this system, they were telling about their experience or memories, and they said it felt like a flow of cycle, you know, like cycling in a stream and everything. So, and then of course we said like, yeah, or we just asked ourselves, maybe it has to do with concepts like the qi, you know, where basically in China a lot of people, a lot of people are doing Tai Chi exercises every day, and is sort of doing something in synchronization with groups in etc. You know, there is a lot of cultural factors that might influence it, but I cannot I don't want to state that this is the reason why, you know. So I think it would be very interesting to look at this, and especially to look at how it's organized, for example, in European context or something, and then compare, I don't know, Asian, like a dominant cycling city in Asia with a dominant cycling city in Europe to a dominant cycling city in Latin America, which I'm not sure, in a small scale exists, but not in a large city. But there is very interesting small cities in Latin America where you have high cycling rates. So I think there is some cultural aspects, but I don't think that it wouldn't work here or here. When I'm saying here, I'm speaking of Vienna, for example, because we have, if you look at our YouTube page, there is a video that we shot 2 years ago in Marie-Hilfer-Straße, which is Europe's longest shared space now, and we just filmed basically like a slow bike ride through this mess, you know. And it totally works, but you realize that the people they have to get used to it, and they have been like super scared and very outspoken about this mess, you know, what is created by it.
I would just to sort of quickly add on the idea of culture. I think that different cultures they create different starting points. The thing with culture is that it is incredibly malleable. You see this everywhere. I mean, Jan Gehl has written quite a bit about it in Copenhagen, talking about how at first, you know, he gets all this resistance saying, hey, we're Danes, we're Copenhageners, we're not the Italians, we don't do this whole street life thing. I mean, there's, to a certain degree, people are people, and to a certain degree, the movements in cities are similar or to the point of almost being universal. You have the sort of Marchetti constant of throughout time and place, people doing about the same amount of trips every day and spending about the same amount of time in motion. Culture presents the starting point, and that's where the obstacles begin to arise. I mean, for example, in Japan, as you mentioned, this idea of sort of sharing space and looking out for each other is much more prominent than, let's say, in the United States, when the idea is, I would say, even to the extreme of, I didn't realize until I started riding a bike that streets were public space. It never occurred to me that streets are actually public and that they are not owned by those driving. So the culture that I had to overcome was this idea of streets are for cars, period. If you're not on a car, you're in the way, you're interfering, you're in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. So, I mean, there's that culture, that sort of culture has to then be addressed and dealt with. And this goes back to the very beginning, the first question of sort of when you try to figure out what to do in a place to support cycling, you got to understand the specific reasons why people aren't cycling. What is the existing culture at the time? But cultures change. New normals arise, and that's, I think, the challenge is how do you move from a sort of old normal to a new one?
Yeah, because, well, the normal is sustained by the infrastructure and the policy, right, to an extent, and the attitudes.
Yeah, the physical environment plays a huge role. I mean, we were chatting earlier, and I think one of the things you had asked was, so what are the big levers or something? What are the cheapest, most effective, like, you know, where do you intervene in the system?
That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Sort of the Pareto principle of how
20%
of the action can create 80% of the result.
Yep.
And how sort of so many cycling schemes have not really had that desired effect, not really created a dominant sort of bicycle urbanism, and how you can most effectively intervene, basically, which obviously varies by situation, but maybe there's something something universal that can be applied.
Well, there are a few
something.
things. I mean, in some ways, I mean, you can simplify pretty much any transport system down to what are the modes that are being used, what are the spaces that they move through, what are the practices, so what trips are being done with these different modes, and then the mindsets, you know, so sort of space, mode, practice, mindset, and with practice, it's also sort of intention. What are you trying to achieve with each trip? And then you begin to get the idea of how these different modes interact with space and all of this. You know, these 4 variables begin to tell you the local situation. If the aim is to basically ask people or invite people not to drive their car and instead to make trips on bike. If this is, you know, defect from the car system and join the bicycle system, then you have to look at, for one, the offer. So what is the current offer with the car system? Can I own a car easily? Can I store it easily? Can I get into it and make my trip and then park at the end of my trip easily? Are all of these things sort of normalized? And is the opposite true for cycling? If that's the case, good luck. You can normalize cycling through infrastructure and make it so great. We're going to have nice bike lanes. We're going to have them, you know, protected from the elements. We're going to have parking, you know, air pumps, all of this perfect thing. But you're still asking me to develop an entirely new normal for my life. That's a big shift. We tend to stick with what we know. So really, it's not a question of waging war on the motorist, for example. I think it's important to remember that the motorist is just a person who happens to be a variety of different things at different times.
Yeah.
So that motorist is also a pedestrian, is also a cyclist, is also, you know, many other things. It is getting into the question of allocation of space and what your priorities are. In order to shift a culture from driving-based or car-based to bike-based, you have to not only, you know, build it in and they will come, you know, provide all of the things that are necessary on the cycling side, but you do need to sort of throw a few sticks at the car system. The 2 easiest ones are convenience and parking. Donald Shoup at UCLA did a big study that was in his book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And he found
Who was that, sorry?
Donald Shoup, Shoup. He was a professor at UCLA, and his book was called The High Cost of Free Parking. What he took, it was a very interesting idea. So we normally pay attention to cars when they're moving.
Yeah.
But cars are only moving for about 5% of their life at most. They spend 95% or more stopped, parked. But we don't tend to look too much at the parking side, not nearly as much as the in-motion side. And what he found was the single biggest lever you can press, if the one intervention that will have the biggest impact on driving is the availability of parking.
Is that specifically free parking or just parking generally?
Well, you can kind of move it down a sort of, you know, series of gradations. If on one side, at the extreme end of the spectrum, I'm convinced before I start my trip that I will find parking easily, I'll find it in a convenient location, and I won't have to pay much for it. This is a huge psychological boost to continue to make the trip by car. The more that those 3 aspects of parking, the cost, the sort of convenience in terms of closeness to your location, the proximity, and the availability, the more that those 3 are working in your favor, the more you're likely to make the trip. If you don't think, if you say, I think I want to take the car, but I really don't think I'm going to find parking, or if I do, it's incredibly expensive, or it won't be near where I'm trying to go, that tends to open your mind up to other possibilities. So the combination of the parking and then the trip itself. I mean, this is something that the Dutch did quite a bit, which is very, very simple and cheap, is you throw up a couple of bollards, you do any variety of different interventions that just mean that you can't go on a straight line in the car from A to B.
Okay, like filtered.
Like in Houghton, you've written about that. I mean, this is the basic idea. You can still say, look, as a car, we're not going to ban you. You know, you can get anywhere, but it's going to be inconvenient. It's going to take longer. You may not be able to park when you get there. That kind of stuff starts opening it up. So the idea of just cutting off through routes and reducing parking, this costs almost nothing. And this can have arguably the single biggest impact at discouraging car use. Now, the other side, you still have to promote the cycling. But what we often forget is nearly every city in the world already has a pretty much perfect cycling system in place. They're called streets. They just have cars on them right now.
Yeah.
And you also, Kieran, you also referred to if there is a sort of tipping point, you know, when you promote cycling, when does cycling become normal? And there is no, in my experience, no one size fits all answer to that. But a lot of people say that it's sort of around 10% cycling mode share. So when every 10th trip in a city is made with the bike, then it becomes normal, and then suddenly there is no longer all these conflicts, etc., etc. And I think that this is actually not far off, because in Vienna we have a little bit over 7% now at the moment, and we have since 5 years we have a more intensified cycling promotion in the sense of campaigns, but also a more structured attempt to close gaps in the infrastructure and to step by step improve the infrastructure here in the city. And when you compare it to 10 years ago, it's really much better actually. And there is a lot more people cycling, especially in the warm months. But we have had a very strong backlash and conversation in media and also in politics about the pros and cons of supporting urban cycling. So we had, for example, a few weeks ago, we had a public poll in Vienna, and 60%, apparently, according to this poll, 60% of the Viennese population think that cyclists are the main problem in urban traffic in this city. So you see that there is a growing resistance to it, and a lot of people have told this from other places that this sort of resistance to cycling is actually the sign that you are successful and that it's sort of becoming normal. So I'm expecting for the next 2 to 5 years that this resistance and this whole debates sort of thins out, and when we reach 10% cycling mode share, we will have a more peaceful situation. But what we also see, when you are successful and bring more people on the street, more cyclists on the road, it can become then dangerous again and inconvenient, because you are there is a lot of people who are stuck on an infrastructure that is actually not made for 8% cyclists or 10% cyclists.
So you get a rise in fatalities and injuries and things like that.
Well, it brings up the challenge of phasing. So, I mean, we can talk about a sort of built-out system where cycling is totally normal, and you don't need cycle lanes because just the bike is the normal way people go. Expect this, and this is sort of the maturation of the system. The challenge, of course, is going from where we are now, which is not that, in nearly all places, to that, and you hit a bunch of these sort of critical points. I think some of the backlash right now is because we have a clear system for cars, we have a clear system for public transport, we have a clear system for pedestrians. With the cycling, you start by saying, is a bike more like a car? Okay, let's say that it is, and we try and have it follow a kind of car logic. Or we'll say a bike is really more like a pedestrian, and we'll try to bring the pedestrians and cyclists together, because it still comes down to the question of allocation of space.
Yeah, well, some bikes are more like cars and some are more like pedestrians, I guess.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting, the allocation of space question. I spoke with someone from Bike Citizens. Do you know Bike Citizens? They're in Vienna as well. His name's Daniel Koffler.
Yes, we know Daniel. You know, Austria is even smaller than the UK, and we of course we know them, and they have been doing a real great work. And I think that, you know, these sort of digital tools and also what they are also doing, you know, to tell stories about cities and allow that people can sort of explore the city on the bike with the help of these digital tools. I think that this is it's very good. Also, they contribute to making cycling sort of cool, you know. From their self-understanding, at least as how I would interpret from talking to them, they you know, they're not only interested in selling an app, you know, they are really interested in promoting cycling and convincing people that the bicycle is actually a smarter choice in cities. So they are doing not only selling an app, but really promoting cycling and changing our cities.
You were asking a question about them?
Well, just one thing he said sprung to mind about something you said about the allocation of private space. When you park your car on the road, you're storing a private vehicle in a public space, but it's the only kind of private thing that you would feasibly leave there. I mean,
if we brought out a bunch of boxes of stuff and just put them on the street and thought that was normal, other people might disagree.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a public space, is it? A parking space. It's like a curious mixture.
It doesn't perform as much of a public space, or let's say that the publicness of it is quite limited.
Well, it's owned by the public and administered by the public, and every member of the public who owns a car by chance can use it, you know. But we also, last year we made a project called Public Platform, where we created a bike trailer which is the same size as an average car, and the idea was that you can cycle this platform somewhere, and then you basically you claim that space. You basically park it, and you claim that space for doing activities. And
you call that a bike platform?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of movable parklet. Of course, it follows the parklet idea.
Oh, okay.
But it adapts to the Viennese or Austrian condition. So this is a legal sort of policy thing that's in the U.S., for example. Where parking day began, the way that those parklets can work is because when you put in your money into that meter, you are renting that for whatever purpose you want.
Yeah.
Here, you are required to use it for parking your car. You need a vehicle to go in there. So this is kind of a way of around that, is you can create a bit of a platform that is essentially a trailer, a vehicle, and then you can park it, and now you can do parking day, having gotten around the sort of requirement. But it also allows you to have a space that levels off with the sidewalk, that sort of extends the reach of the sidewalk. So I mean, it's doing the function of parking day, but a little bit more as well, showing how a bit more infrastructure could sort of change the street.
Can you ship some of these over?
Yeah, but that what we find is quite remarkable, because we are working since a few years now on all these issues and topics, and with really a lot of things, it happens that suddenly somebody around the world makes something very similar, although you haven't had any contact with that person before. So we really think that there is a sort of boiling up of a paradigm shift, and which is still where, let's say, building a great network of bike paths which follow the logic of a separated traffic system within a car system is still not a paradigm shift, you know. It's still not changing about, it's still not thinking about a changed way of organizing our streets as public spaces.
It may be a necessary step, again, depending on local conditions, but I mean, I don't think many of us I'd say any of us who are talking about bicycle urbanism do not see the sort of end goal to simply be to have some segregated lanes for bikes in streets that are otherwise still dominated by cars.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's this, I mean, what strikes me as interesting about your bike platform is that it's a vehicle. Because there's the company here called Cycle Hoop. They do like bike infrastructure which is like bolt on. So it's for cities like in transition. So, you know, parking rail that can bolt onto a lamppost or something like this, which slots into the existing urban fabric without too much ado. But I hadn't heard of it sort of exploiting a loophole in that way.
Well, this is also just sort of taking inspiration from what's around you. I mean, Vienna's a city where during the summer, the population thins out quite a bit. A lot of people are on vacation for a month or so. They go off to you know, homes out in the country. You have a lot less traffic. Students are gone for the summer. You know, you have whatever it is, 150, 200,000 students in Vienna. So the way that a lot of businesses respond to that is by essentially just renting for very little money, nearly nothing, the parking spots on the street, and then extending their business out to it by creating an outdoor terrace or a little garden, tables for cafes or restaurants. And you see that happening in more and more places. So originally, I think it was only for 3 or 4 months. Now I think it's actually extended to about 6 months that you can do this. You can sort of occupy what was a parking spot for cars with some alternative use. And you'll see multiple places on the street doing that. And you get places on both sides doing it. And all of a sudden you start to have an idea of what that street would be if it simply removed the parking. You get an idea of the possibilities. And so, I mean, that was, again, mostly done for restaurants or cafes to have outdoor seating. But you can also, if you're private residents, let's say enough people within a building can simply fill out the form and say, hey, this parking spot out in front of our building, we want to turn this into a little parklet. You know, it's continuing to just expand on that idea of, if we didn't have to just put a car there, what could you do?
Yeah.
So, you know, having a sort of mobile platform it's not the build out answer, it's the transition, it's part of the transition approach. Or just being able to bring it in and do almost anything on it. But to be able to, you know, bring it to its location and move it away by bike also begins to show the sort of utility of moving around that way.
Oh, I think that's really great. I think this is the exciting thing. This is it's almost more exciting than when you have the final thing, the sort of the way you get there, the chance to have ideas and innovate in that way. And it's interesting how that can empower people. You know, how it can just be something that people can do sort of from a sort of grassroots guerrilla sort of.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's in a lot of places, you know, in the world, there is different approaches how administration and how cities can support or facilitate that citizens actually look around in their communities and use streets again as public space, because I mean, it is known, but to a lot of people, it's not on a day-to-day basis conscious, you know, that streets have been super messy and they have been the place where all urban life actually took place before the car came, you know, that the street was the place where children played, where stuff was sold, where people moved,
Yeah.
where people talked, where business was done, etc. You know, and
guess
we're
this is
curious to see where you know, where in cities like Vienna that get more dense, that realize that the city is too dense and too that public space is too scarce to use it for the car. So where that sort of, and how that future urban life will play out, it's very interesting to see. But it's something that that mankind has done before. You know, it's not that we cannot do it. You know, just
no, which means it has the danger of sounding regressive.
yes, I know, but we are not. That's the. That's a bit. That's. I think that you. It's a very good point, because when we started to work in China, especially, I think our problem was that we sounded too regressive for people, especially as mostly Western people in China. Trying to convince people that the bike is a clever idea, you know, and they basically said, yeah, but we had it before. What we want now is cars. So what do you want to tell us now? And now, 5 years later, the government and increasingly the people are realizing, okay, no, it's not working for us. Our cities will choke on the car, so we will have to find a new solution. They are doing things really quickly and on a massive scale. So I'm very excited on that. But we have been a bit too early with our clever advices. But yeah, but it's also for us, you know. Here, I wanted to say that before when we talked about where cycling can go. You know, what I think is really interesting when you talk to people as a sort of, let's say, quote unquote cycling advocate, you know, or bicycle evangelist, or however you want to call it, you know, then you tell people, you know, it's so it's very good for health, it's good for the environment, it's good for urban life, it's just a great thing to do, and then you sound regressive to people just because you don't want to use a motorized car. And I also I'm sort of a bit I'm disappointed by the smartness of our decision makers and everybody, because I'm quite often in conferences and places where people talk about how to reduce the carbon footprint, for example, of our society. And I know that there is a lot of economic interest behind how things are going, but if we take the goals and the challenges seriously, the most efficient way to reduce emissions is by not having emissions in the first place, right? So I'm getting a little frustrated when, for example, the Austrian state is putting massive amounts of money into subsidizing electric cars, while they still do a little bit of a job, but not a job as they could do to promote and support urban cycling, for example, or cycling as a mode of transport, and really think about how we can make our cities fit for a post fossil fuel condition. So this is really I think this is a very important question what we need to answer. You know, why are we getting always pushed in this regressive corner, you know, when we argue for the bike? I think this is very interesting. But it of course it has these effects that urban cycling as a strategy is sort of, you know, you have your cycling niche, but it's not really a serious thing, you know, what we consider on a large scale.
Just to respond to this as well, to me it has everything to do with the narratives that sort of govern our lives and create sort of momentum towards the future. So if we talk about technology or innovation or progress, what do we actually mean? Right? The purpose of technology, innovation, progress is to somehow make our lives better. So what is it that makes our lives better? And if you look at things, I mean, if we just make the argument and say, well, look, we want to have fewer emissions, and bikes have fewer emissions, so we should support that. That is almost regressive, because you're only sort of looking at sort of how do you minimize a damage. It's important, it's part of the message. But to look at the other side and say, what is it we want? We want clean air. We want, we don't want to be bombarded with noise. We want, you know, attractive, desirable public spaces. We want to have a social life that we find rewarding. You know, the opportunity to develop community or even just informal interactions in public space. We want better health. We want to spend less on healthcare. I mean, there's a whole series of things that we say.
Think of the children.
Exactly. You know, like you had mentioned earlier, looking at sort of the most vulnerable, the least mobile. If you're focused on that stuff, and then you look at the kind of environment, the sort of physical or social environment that supports it, it's not by having a city that's based, or an urban transport system that's based around cars. They simply require too much space, too much energy, have too many emissions. There are too many things that we have to sort of work against.
And it also it also doesn't change if they're electrified.
No, it's
do you think that this...
it's weird. But there, you know, I talked with some colleagues that are also working on some cutting edge universities and institutions that have all these triple letter abbreviations, whatnot. And there is, I think it's an interesting time, because sort of 200 to 150 years ago, the bicycle and the car had a sort of parallel evolution, you know, where there were the velocipede was invented, and then they took they sort of redeveloped the horse carriage, and then they took some steering mechanisms that were developed for the bike, they put them on those. They developed ball bearings, then they put the ball bearings on the horse carriage, so on and so forth. So a lot of innovation went back and forth, and these sort of siblings, the car and the bike, they grew up, and the car took over. And I think now we are at a point in time where sort of the simplicity of the bike might influence this car on steroids, you know, where you say, maybe a car doesn't need to be so large, you know, maybe a car especially with a non-combustion engine, with electric engines, you can also make them smaller, and it helps you a lot if you don't have a car that is as heavy as a Tesla to move in an electric engine. So there is a lot of interesting concepts where actually sort of cars become very small and turn into hybrid vehicles, like, you know, where you put in a little bit of activity. So I think we are going to see a lot there. So, but I think there is we need to consider this sort of holy trinity of future mobility, which is basically shared, electric, and also automated. If we really discuss this.
Okay. It's sort of, I was going to ask you, you've sort of answered my question, but I was going to ask you what you think. I mean, we were talking about getting frustrated that the authorities don't necessarily recognize these benefits and are focused elsewhere. But how, I was going to say, do you think change can be precipitated? I mean, if it can come from the ground up, like grassroots sort of people taking charge, or if it needs to be top down, or if it's something that just arises, if it's something that can just be sort of a naturally emerging with developing technology, almost like car urbanism has been.
I mean, again, this kind of still goes back to the question of allocation of space. And if you sort of take an economic approach to it, and if you see the commodity you're dealing with is space, then you have a sort of supply and demand relationship. I think you need the bottom up to create the demand for that space, for a change in allocation, for a new set of conditions. And you need top down, because they're the ones who are funding, maintaining, managing, regulating the existing system that is not conducive to cycling. So, you know, you need both of those. One way that you see it happen in quite a few places is it starts with a sort of ground up swell, that's usually a very limited number of hardcore cyclists. It might be 10, 20, 30, it might be 100 people who just decide, I will cycle with cars. They're fast, aggressive, tend to be young males. But the more of them and the longer they do it, the more that they begin to normalize it in the minds of the next group, which tend to be maybe a little bit less sporty students, people who have short trips. You start to kind of open it up for a second wave. The more that second wave comes in, the more they normalize it. And then, of course, the end goal is when you have, children, women, and elderly, those who tend to be either most at risk physically or just in terms of perception. And then it kind of begins to normalize.
But there are casualties with each wave.
Yeah, I also want to add something because you notice the bottom and the top. I very often feel that they are not like strata that are separated completely. There is maybe a person in administration which has strong ties to a specific political figure. I'm just sketching stuff up now, but that person is maybe into or cycling herself or himself personally and just knows the daily life or whatever. So it's very often it happens on both levels, but of course you sort of need this, what Josh called a new normal and a new zeitgeist to create change. And of course politicians, in order for them to stay in power or to justify certain measures, they also need to feel at least a little bit of support and demand from the population. So I think there is really a lot when it comes to bottom-up initiatives where change can take place. A very, very strong example is the people's decision on mobility now that was taken in Berlin in Germany. Okay. They basically what they did is very interesting because they didn't communicate cyclists versus cars or something like that. They just said we want to have equal conditions for cycling as mobility in the city, and we want to have a fair share of the infrastructure budget. Of the when cyclists are killed, it's not something that's a cavalier thing that's happening. It's a real problem, and it shows you that we have to change something. And they collected within, I think, 3 weeks 100,000 signatures or something. It was a massive movement where a lot of people invested themselves. And what happened there is they had this catalog of demands, and then a new government came in, and the new government took this catalog of demands immediately into the sort of government contract or into the government program. Yeah. So without even going through the whole process, which should have been happen afterwards with a people's decision, they sort of changed the normal to a completely different one. But I was told by the people who were executing this, they just felt that sort of the debate in the public was ready for it, and also in the media that this was ready for it, and they also decided to frame it in a way, basically saying, look, we are cyclists, we are not your enemy, but we also want to use the city, and we also have a right to use the city. And so I think this is a very good example where basically the bottom up can totally create this new normal and then create decisions that are very meaningful.
That, like you were saying, that sort of tipping point, that sort of relies on there being a sort of established presence for people to just have that awareness of cycling. Because, like you were saying, in Vienna, you said the 60% figure. Well, in most places, it's probably more than 60% of people have a vested interest in driving. So that they, and then you probably have this hardcore niche of people that are prepared to fight quite strongly for cycling. And it's probably just been like fluke incidents when, like in the Netherlands, when it's been the majority of people who have wanted to cycle and who have created enough sort of unrest, enough sort of disturbance and action to create change. But it's when that gradual growth happens. That gradual growth happens up to a point, and then it can start really influencing. So the bottom up grows to a point, and then it can start influencing the top down. I guess that's the tipping point.
Well, a nice way, even in the beginning, even when you don't have, let's say, a big critical mass yet. I mean, there's nothing better than having the actual experience of doing something. To take it out of the abstract or take it off of a plan or paper and have the sort of lived experience of doing it. This can happen just by organizing bike rides. Something as simple as getting some of maybe the hardcore group together that's already doing it, bringing them together with city officials and planners, and just going on group rides together. It democratizes things. Somehow all of a sudden you're out and you're riding bikes. A little bit of that kid in all of us comes back. It becomes easier to sort of talk across whatever borders may have prevented, maybe more sort of fluid discourse or discussion. There's some, and there are a lot of really nice programs that are dealing with some of this. Brussels started it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a nice pilot program where they just said to people who drive from home to work, if you want to try being a daily commuter on a bike for 2 weeks or a month or something, I forget the time, we'll provide you with a bike and we'll provide you with a guide, somebody who is, will meet you basically at your home and ride with you. And what they did is they recognized one of the obstacles, which was the fear of doing something new on their own. They reduced that obstacle by bringing in somebody that you do it with, who knows it. And then so what they found was, I think after whatever it was, 2 weeks or a month, there was something like 50% of people continued to ride their bike. It was a huge,
where was that, sorry?
Huge turnover rate. And then they expanded the program. And my numbers are not accurate. This is just from memory, but it was something like the first year, 30 or 40 people, and then 80, and then 150, and then 400. There are so many different types of interventions or actions like this that just bring people together, put them on a bike in space, let them experience it for themselves. And all of the things that then we begin to see become obvious. Then you go to a planner and you talk about the speed of cars and they go, oh yeah, when we were on that street and a car flew past me really fast, it felt dangerous. Now they get it. Yeah.
Where was that example of the guide? Sorry.
In Brussels.
Brussels.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting one.
There is really interesting low-cost initiatives, where you don't need to build like cycle lanes so much or something, but you just you also use the bike as a tool to bring people together. I think that this is interesting, like all these buddy initiatives, and even schools, cycling schools for kids and everything. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of thing could tie quite neatly into that sort of app that bike citizens are developing. If it tied into that, then I think that could work quite well. It's just giving people that ease of access to a cycling community and knowing where to ride and in one place. Shall we wrap up this discussion?
Yeah, I think Kieran, it's been really great, and I'm sure that we will meet again, either in a hangout, which will hopefully work from the start the next time, or in person, wherever that might be in the future. It's we're looking forward to more of your work. What's maybe a question for you.
Yeah.
What's your next moves with your whole bicycle urbanism?
Let's do a sort of double question for you. What are your next moves, as Flo is asking, but also what are the next moves in Bristol? What is your city doing, and how is it moving forward and recognizing some of the challenges?
Well, I don't think it is really. It's just reacting. It's like and if you look at other cities in the UK, like Oxford or Cambridge, where there are even higher levels of cycling, it's not because of the infrastructure. It's not because it's been provided for. It's just because there's a lot of people that want to cycle, and it's reached a point where cycling has become popular, so they feel able to. So I don't. The next steps. I'm not sure. I think it has to come from the people in a way. It's like a microcosm of the problems that you might see in like Copenhagen with bike parking and bike parking, a lack of bike parking. So it's just, I can see that the authorities will sort of just continue to address things. Things will gradually get redeveloped, but in a piecemeal fashion. It's not like in Seville where they're going to come in and produce a big network of paths and then it's going to have fast changes. That doesn't really happen here. I think it'll just be a slow process, but it'd be nice if they could get someone to come in and consult. Like I was talking with Stephen Fleming, who does sort of consultancy, and how if they could get someone like that in to analyze the city from the perspective of a cyclist and look at spaces within the city where you can feel safe on a bike and just work towards making a map, sort of like that guy in Kuala Lumpur. Even though in Kuala Lumpur there's hardly any cyclists, but he made a whole map for cyclists, which is crowdsourced. So where do people currently cycle in Kuala Lumpur? And then once you have that map of where people are cycling, you can overlay that with a map of where people perhaps want to cycle, destinations, common points, and then that can create some kind of that can inform the production of this infrastructure, be that negotiated flow or segregated lanes or whatever. But that's just utopian thinking. I'm just hoping that if I can keep talking about it and keep discussing it and raising awareness and sort of thinking about how it can be accomplished and being aware that, like you say about the normals, just being aware that this is a normal, and it doesn't have to be the normal.
I think there are three, or sort of my final word here would be three strategies that can be applied in Bristol or just about anywhere else. One is visioning in a way that is path breaking. So part of what you have to kind of get past or overcome are the path dependencies of an existing system that is not conducive to cycling. So to go on to have visioning exercises where you really, really go for it, go beyond just what would it be like to have nice segregated lanes, to sort of do the deep dive with the question of, if we just made biking the top of the priority in planning, in design, in policy, what would that mean? How would that change our streets? How would that change our practices? How would that change our mindsets? Like have that kind of visioning types of exercises. A second thing is pick the low-hanging fruit. Make all of the changes that are easy. Identify all the little small things that begin to add up, that each on their own are not so difficult and perhaps not so impactful. But after a while, picking them one at a time, they start to mean something. The third thing is to then try and find places where you can sort of, you can do modeling. This is, where can you find a single block even where you can build out that path-breaking vision. For example, there's a street in Vienna, there's several where this has happened, where just one block, normal street, cars parked on the side, no bike lanes, narrow sidewalks, most of the road given to car traffic, but they took a single block and cut it off to through traffic for cars,
okay.
and then
like super block.
it. So this one block could become almost like a park, but you can still walk through it, you can still cycle through it, you can still have emergency vehicle access, but that one block begins to let you see, what if you extended this idea?
Okay. So you're starting in a small
these
space.
three combinations, the sort of visioning, picking the low-hanging fruit, and then modeling the vision in small scales where you can. These three things are, I think, really start working together to open up space for some kind of a new normal to emerge.
That's yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kieran.
Yeah.
And let's keep in touch for all the people who watched and will watch. Thanks, and we're looking forward to what you put in writing from this, Kieran. Or if you have any further question, just hit us up. And yeah, let's scheme for something else other than a hangout.
Yeah, definitely.
In Vienna, we'll go for a bike ride.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Me too. I'm still at work, so I'll bike home.
Okay.
Nice to speak with you.
Yes,
well.
likewise. Okay. Bye, Kieran.
All right. Bye.